The first time Elsie Bancroft heard the name Clyde Townsend, it was spoken with the particular cruelty that small towns reserved for those they had already decided to throw away. She had been standing at the counter of Hargrove's General Store in the dusty railroad town of Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1878, when she overheard two men leaning against the outer wall of the store, their voices carrying easily through the propped-open door. The afternoon sun was merciless and white, and the street outside was the color of old bones. Elsie had come to Caldwell 6 weeks prior to take up a position as a schoolteacher, having traveled west from her family's home in Cincinnati with a single trunk, a letter of introduction from the Methodist Board of Education, and a quiet determination that she would not waste her life in someone else's drawing room. "Townsend's out there again," the first man said, and there was a lazy contempt in his voice that made Elsie's jaw tight even before she understood the conversation. "Saw him from the road this morning, working that south field like the Lord Almighty himself was watching. Half a man trying to do a whole man's work," the second man said, and both of them laughed. It was the kind of laugh that had no humor in it, only the satisfaction of diminishment. Elsie set down the tin of baking powder she had been examining and looked at the storekeeper, Mr. Hargrove, a pale, mild-mannered man who appeared to find the floor very interesting whenever anything unpleasant was said in his establishment. "Who is Clyde Townsend?" she asked him plainly. Hargrove cleared his throat. "Homesteader. Has a quarter section about 4 miles east of town. Lost his left arm below the elbow at the Battle of Palo Duro Canyon back in '74. Some folks think he ought to have sold that land and moved on to something easier. He won't hear of it." "And those men outside think that makes him half a man," Elsie said. It was not a question. Hargrove looked at her with a faint, surprised respect. "Those men think a lot of things, Miss Bancroft. Most of them aren't worth repeating." She paid for her supplies, tucked them into the basket over her arm, and walked out of the store past the two men without looking at them. She drove her borrowed wagon back toward the small house the school board had arranged for her near the schoolhouse, and she thought about a man working a field alone in the Kansas spring, and about all the ways that people could be wrong about a person before they had even introduced themselves. She did not go looking for Clyde Townsend, but Caldwell was not a large town, and the world has a way of arranging meetings that seem inevitable in hindsight. It was a Tuesday morning in early April when she first laid eyes on him. She had been walking the road east of town because she liked the mornings, when the air was still cool and smelled of grass and distant rain. She rounded a gentle rise in the road, and there he was, in a field that had been recently broken, the dark earth turned up in long furrows that were as straight as ruled lines. He was driving a single-bottom plow behind a big, steady-tempered bay horse, and even from the road Elsie could see the particular configuration of the arrangement he had designed to manage the plow with one full arm and one shortened one. He had fashioned what appeared to be a leather brace along the left handle of the plow, something that cradled his arm, and allowed him to guide and steer with the pressure of his body, rather than a grip he could not fully form. The whole operation was deliberate and exact, and the field he was turning was evidence enough that it worked, because the rows were something close to perfection. He did not see her at first. She stood at the fence line and watched him work, not out of rudeness or fascination with his injury, but because there was something compelling about the sight of a man who had clearly made a thorough study of the problem before him and solved it with intelligence and care. The horse moved at an even pace, and Clyde Townsend moved with it, his broad shoulders leaning into the turn at the end of each row, his voice low and steady when he spoke to the animal. Then he glanced up and saw her standing there. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 28 or 29, with dark hair under a worn hat and a face that was weathered but not unkind. He had the kind of features that were not immediately remarkable but grew more interesting the longer you looked at them. A strong jaw, steady dark eyes, a mouth that seemed to have forgotten how to waste itself on unnecessary words. He looked at her for a moment without expression, then nodded, a brief acknowledgement that did not invite conversation and did not discourage it either. Elsie was 25 years old, and she had been educated in a way that most women of her generation were not, and she had very little patience for the social performance of helplessness. She nodded back. "Good morning," she called across the fence. "That is a fine arrangement you have there with the brace." He stopped the horse. He studied her for a moment as if assessing whether she was being kind in a patronizing way or honest in a useful one. Whatever he saw appeared to satisfy him. "Took me most of the winter to get it right," he said. His voice was lower than she expected, even across the distance. "Third version is the one that works. What did the first two versions teach you?" He tilted his head slightly, and something moved in his expression that might have been the beginning of a real engagement with her. "First one put too much strain on my shoulder. Second one gave me good control but slowed the horse down. Third one spread the work between the brace and my hip when I lean into the turn." "That is good engineering," Elsie said. "It is farming," he said. "The two are not so different," she said, and she meant it, and from the way his expression shifted again, he heard that she did. She introduced herself and he introduced himself, and that was the beginning of it, though neither of them would have described it as a beginning at the time. They were simply two people on either side of a fence on a spring morning in Kansas, talking about the mechanics of a plow. She saw him again the following week at Hargrove's store. He was loading supplies into a wagon with the practiced efficiency of a man who had long since stopped thinking about how he managed things and simply managed them. He handled a 50-pound sack of grain with a sort of controlled pivot that used his shoulder and forearm and the weight of his torso, setting it into the wagon bed with as little ceremony as anyone else would have managed it with two hands. The two men she had heard on her first day. She had since learned their names were Garrett and Pitts, both of them with nothing more productive to do than lean against buildings and pass judgment, were watching from across the street with expressions of faint amusement. "Still at it, Townsend," Garrett called out. "You know the soil bank over in Wichita's taking on laborers, work that might suit you better." Clyde loaded a second sack without looking at them. "I appreciate your concern about my livelihood, Garrett. You can keep it. We're just saying, a man ought to know his limitations." Clyde set the second sack and then turned to look at them, unhurried and level. "I've got 80 acres of winter wheat coming in better than anything on the south quarter of this county. I've got 12 head of cattle, a hog operation that turned a profit last season, and a root cellar that'll see me through anything the plains care to throw at me. You want to tell me more about my limitations, or do you want to go find something to do with your afternoon?" Garrett had nothing to say to that. Neither did Pitts. Elsie, who had come around the corner of the store at the tail end of this exchange, pretended she had not heard any of it. She went to the counter and asked Hargrove for a length of blue ribbon and a bottle of ink, and when Clyde came in to settle his account, she did not remark on what she had witnessed. But the image of it stayed with her, the calm in his voice, the complete absence of any need to be believed or validated, the simple enumeration of facts. He had not defended himself by minimizing his injury or pretending it wasn't there. He had simply pointed to what he had built. "Miss Bancroft," he said, nodding to her on his way to the door. "Mr. Townsend," she said, "your wheat is coming in nicely. I drove that road yesterday morning." He paused at the door. "You are up early for your walks." "I find the mornings suit my thinking," she said. "So do I," he said, and he went out. Hargrove glanced at her with a small smile that he was clearly trying not to have. It was another 2 weeks before anything of real significance happened between them, and it came about not through any romantic design, but through the ordinary urgency of a situation that required one person to help another. Elsie had been at the schoolhouse on a late Friday afternoon, staying after the children had gone home to prepare the following week's lessons. She had 22 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, and the work of teaching them all within a single room with a single teacher was genuinely demanding. She was absorbed in the preparation of a geography lesson when she heard a commotion in the yard and went to the window. A horse, a young, half-broke sorrel she recognized as belonging to the livery, had somehow gotten loose and was running in tight, panicked circles in the schoolyard, its lead rope dragging and its eyes white. Two men from down the street were trying to corner it, which was making things considerably worse. Clyde Townsend happened to be riding past on the road. He pulled up his own horse, the big, reliable bay, assessed the situation for perhaps 3 seconds, then dismounted with the easy certainty of a man who had dealt with frightened horses before. He left his bay ground-tied. The animal stood perfectly still, a testament to training, and walked into the schoolyard with his hat in his right hand, taking a long, curved path around the sorrel rather than approaching straight on. He spoke to the horse. Elsie could not hear the words from the window, but she could see the effect of them. The sorrel's frantic circling slowed, and its head came down a degree, and it began to track Clyde with its ears. He moved slowly, never directly toward the horse, always at an angle, always giving it room. The two men from the street had gone still, because it was obvious that any movement from them now would undo whatever Clyde was achieving. After 5 or 6 minutes, the sorrel let Clyde take hold of the lead rope. He ran his hand up the horse's neck and spoke close to its ear, and the animal stood trembling but contained, its panic replaced by something closer to exhausted relief. Elsie walked out of the schoolhouse. "That was masterfully done," she said. He handed the lead rope to the livery man who had come running from down the street, red-faced and apologetic. "He's young," Clyde said of the horse. "Young and scared. No cruelty needed, just patience." He put his hat back on. He looked at Elsie with those quiet, dark eyes, and she had the distinct impression that he was about to simply say good afternoon and ride on, which was exactly what he would have done on any previous occasion. But instead he said, "Are you settled here, Miss Bancroft? Caldwell treating you well enough?" The question was simple, but the asking of it meant something. It was the first time he had shown any curiosity about her situation, the first time the conversation had moved from accidental exchange to something with a little intention in it. "I am settled well enough," she said. "The children are bright and willing, which is more than I could have asked for. The town is," she paused, choosing her words carefully, still making up its mind about a woman teaching school. "Some folks here are slow to decide things," he agreed, "and some have already decided things without bothering to think about them." "You would know something about that," she said, and it came out more directly than she intended, and she wondered for a moment if she had overstepped. But his expression did not close. "I would," he said. "It troubled me more in the early days than it does now." "What changed?" He looked at the field behind the schoolhouse, at the long grass moving in the afternoon wind, and then back at her. "The wheat kept growing regardless of what anyone thought about me," he said. "Results have a way of ending conversations." She laughed, a real laugh, not a polite one, and he seemed surprised by it. And then something in the corners of his eyes warmed in a way she found entirely disarming. He came to the schoolhouse again the following Friday, not to see her precisely, but to repair a section of the fence around the yard that had been knocked down by a passing wagon. The school board had been meaning to address it for weeks, and Clyde had apparently mentioned to the board's chairman that he would handle it. He arrived with lumber and tools and set to work without fanfare. Elsie brought him water and stayed to talk while he worked, and this was the first of the conversations that mattered. They talked about Kansas and about the territory and about what the land was becoming. She told him about Cincinnati and about why she had wanted to come west, which was not merely for the adventure of it. She had never been a woman who wanted adventure for its own sake, but because she had a genuine belief that education in the frontier communities was not a luxury but an architecture, that you could not build a civilization worth having without it. He listened to her with a quality of attention she had rarely encountered in a man, or in many people of any kind. He did not interrupt. He did not form his response while she was still speaking. He actually absorbed what she said and then responded to it. "My mother taught me to read," he said, pausing in his hammering to look at her. "In a one-room house in Missouri with 4 other children making noise and a father who thought books were for people with nothing better to do. She did it anyway every night by lamplight. I've carried every word she ever read me." "Is she living?" Elsie asked. "No," he said, and the word was quiet but not raw, the grief in it an old and familiar thing. "She died in '71, influenza. I am sorry." "She would have liked you," he said, matter-of-factly, and then seemed to realize what he had said and returned his attention to the fence. The warmth that moved through Elsie at those words was something she chose to examine privately and at her own pace. She was not the kind of woman who was swept away. She had seen what being swept away had done to her older sister in Cincinnati, who had married a charming man who turned out to be mostly charm and very little else. Elsie had decided young that she would be deliberate about love if it came to her, that she would look at the whole of a person's character before she let her heart make any commitments. But she was finding, as the spring deepened into a warm and spectacular Kansas summer, that deliberation and the particular flutter she felt when she saw Clyde Townsend's wagon coming down the road were not entirely incompatible. He began to find reasons to come by more often. They were always practical reasons. He needed to speak with the school board chairman, whose office was near the schoolhouse. He was passing through on the road anyway. He had brought a dozen eggs from his hens because he had more than he needed. She received each reason at face value, because she understood that this was a man who did not know very well how to offer himself without a practical justification, and she found this more endearing than any number of practice compliments would have been. The town of Caldwell watched all of this with the concentrated attention that small towns bring to bear on anything that looks like it might become a romance. The general opinion was divided. There were those, like Hargrove and the school board chairman, a decent man named Aldrich, who thought it a fine development. And there were those, represented most vocally by Garrett and Pitts, and a woman named Mabel Sutton who ran the town's gossip as efficiently as she ran the dressmaker's shop, who felt that Clyde Townsend was not a suitable match for the schoolteacher. Elsie was not a woman who made important decisions based on the opinions of Mabel Sutton. In the middle of June, a significant event occurred that shifted the nature of things between Elsie and Clyde in a way that neither of them had anticipated. A young boy in Elsie's class, 8-year-old Thomas Aldrich, the school board chairman's son, had taken a fall from a horse while riding to school and broken his wrist badly. His horse had bolted and not returned, and Thomas had walked the last mile to school holding his wrist and not crying, which Elsie recognized as a form of extraordinary bravery in an 8-year-old. She had sent the other children home early and gone with Thomas to the doctor, and afterward she needed to get him home, which was 4 miles out on the North Road. Clyde happened to be at the post office when she came out looking for a way to transport Thomas. He took one look at the child's splinted arm and Elsie's expression and said, "Get in," meaning his wagon. They drove Thomas home, and Clyde was gentle and easy with the boy, talking to him about horses in a way that was informative and interesting rather than distractingly cheerful, treating him as a person rather than a child who needed coddling. When they had delivered Thomas safely to his mother and were driving back toward town in the long summer evening, with the prairie gold and wide around them and the sky turning colors that seemed to belong to some other, more extravagant world, Elsie said, "You are very good with children." "I like them," he said simply. "They don't waste time pretending. You want children of your own someday." She asked it with a directness that surprised herself, but the evening had a quality to it that seemed to make directness the right instrument. He was quiet for a moment. The horse moved at an easy walk. The grasses on either side of the road moved in the evening wind. "I want a life," he said carefully. "I've wanted that since I came home from the canyon. A life that's mine, land, work, something growing, something permanent. Children are part of that life if the right circumstances come around." He glanced at her. "What about you? You came a long way from Cincinnati." I came a long way from what I was expected to do, she said. I was expected to marry a man from a good family and manage a good house and be a good example to my children about the importance of being agreeable. It seemed like very small architecture to me. And what do you want instead? She looked at the prairie, at the enormous impersonal beauty of it, at the last light catching the tops of the grasses. Something true, she said. A life that is genuinely mine, not a performance of what a life is supposed to look like. Work I believe in. And if love comes, she paused, I want it to be real, not a performance either. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that only happened between two people who had found, to their mutual careful surprise, that they understood each other. He walked her to her door that evening, which he had never done before, and at the door he held her hand for a moment, just held it briefly, with a gravity that made the gesture mean 10 times what it would have in lighter company. And then he said good night and drove away, and Elsie stood at her door and listened to the sound of the wagon getting smaller in the dark, and she understood that she was falling in love with Clyde Townsend, and that it was not a performance of any kind, but the absolutely real and particular thing. The next morning, Mabel Sutton came to the schoolhouse before the children arrived, and she made herself comfortable in the way that women like Mabel Sutton made themselves comfortable in spaces that were not theirs. And she said that she thought Elsie ought to know that Clyde Townsend was not the man he appeared to be on the surface, that his injury had left him bitter and difficult, that he had quarreled with 2 of his neighbors, that a man who could not do the full work of farming had no business asking a woman to share that burden. Elsie listened to the entirety of this, and then she said, Mrs. Sutton, I have seen Clyde Townsend's farm. I have seen his fields and his animals and the quality of his thinking and the steadiness of his character. I have never in my life seen a whole man accomplish half of what he does every single day. So I will thank you for your concern and ask you to let me make my own determinations. Mabel Sutton left in a state of compressed displeasure. Hargrove later told Elsie, with visible enjoyment, that Mabel had repeated that exchange to at least 5 people on her way home, apparently as evidence of Elsie's poor judgment, but that the effect had been entirely the opposite of what Mabel intended, because 3 of the 5 people had found themselves quite moved by what Elsie had said. In July, things became complicated in a way that had nothing to do with town gossip. A man named Vernon Cole arrived in Caldwell. He was a land speculator from St. Louis, well dressed in the fashion that men from St. Louis wore when they wanted to impress Kansas, and he had been buying up homestead claims throughout the south quarter of the county. He had an option on a neighboring piece of land that shared a fence line with Clyde's property, and he wanted Clyde's quarter section as part of a larger consolidation he was assembling for a cattle company that would run cattle through from Texas. Cole made Clyde an offer, which Clyde declined. Cole made a second offer, considerably higher, which Clyde also declined. Cole then began to pursue a different strategy, which was to question the validity of Clyde's original homestead filing, suggesting that the paperwork had not been properly completed during the period after Clyde had returned from the army. This was not an unusual tactic in 1878. Land speculators had well-established relationships with certain county clerks and land office officials, and the machinery of dispossession was not always as rusty as it should have been. Clyde came to Elsie's house on a Thursday evening, which was also somewhat unprecedented, and she could see from the way he stood at her door straight, but with a tightness around his eyes, that something had gone wrong. She brought him inside and sat him at her kitchen table and put coffee on, and he told her about Cole and the filing questions, and she listened with growing attention because she had a mind well suited to the untangling of complex problems, and she could see the shape of what Cole was attempting. "Have you got copies of the original filing?" she asked. "At the land office. Cole has a man at the land office. Have you got your own copies at home?" Was quiet for a moment. "I have some papers. I don't know if they are complete." Then we need to look at what you have and understand what is missing, she said, with the same practical clarity she brought to a difficult problem in arithmetic with one of her older students. There is a lawyer in Wichita, Mr. Caldwell. I know him slightly because he helped process the school board's charter, who could advise us on the strength of the filing. He looked at her. Us, he said. She met his eyes evenly. Yes, she said. Us. The word settled between them with a weight that was larger than the land question. He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him choosing to receive what she was offering, which was not a simple thing for a man who had been managing everything alone for 4 years. All right, he said. Us. They drove to Wichita the following week in his wagon, a full day's trip each way, with the papers he had gathered wrapped in oilcloth in her bag. They stayed at different establishments, which was the only proper arrangement, but they spent the better part of the day with the lawyer, a precise, energetic man named Caldwell who had the habit of reading documents the way a doctor read wounds, carefully, and without any pretense that the news would be better than it was. The news was, in fact, reasonably good. Clyde's filing was sound. There was a technical omission in the completion paperwork from 1874, the year after the injury, when Clyde had been at a military hospital in Fort Leavenworth during the period when the annual proof of residency should have been filed. But Caldwell said this was a correctable deficiency, and that moreover there was a provision in the Homestead Act for veterans with service-related disabilities, and that Cole's challenge, while potentially costly in time and legal fees, was unlikely to succeed if properly defended. Clyde paid Caldwell's retainer for money he had apparently been saving, and they walked out into the Wichita street in the late afternoon, and Elsie felt the relief coming off him like heat. Thank you, he said, and the simplicity of it was enormous. You would have found Caldwell eventually on your own, she said. Maybe. But you knew him already, and you organized the papers in an order that made his work take half the time, and you asked the 3 questions I didn't think to ask. He stopped walking and looked at her, there on the busy Wichita street with the traffic and the heat and the noise all around them. You are the most useful person I have ever known, she laughed. Most men would not begin a declaration with the word useful. His expression shifted, and he said, most men would be starting with something that was less true and more impressive. I don't know how to do that. I know, she said. That is one of the things I like most about you. They had dinner at a proper restaurant that evening, and it was the first time they had been together in a setting that was openly social rather than incidentally so. And it was the first time they dressed for each other, which is to say he had put on his good jacket, and she had put on a blue dress that Hargrove's wife had been kind enough to take in at the waist for her, and they sat across a table from each other with white cloth and real glassware between them, and talked for 3 hours about everything and nothing, about Missouri and Ohio and Kansas, and what the country was becoming, about books, and about the nature of courage, and about what they each believed, and somewhere in the middle of the second hour Clyde reached across the table and took her hand, not briefly this time but steadily, and she let him, and neither of them mentioned it directly, but both of them knew that something had been decided that night in Wichita over chicken and cornbread and 2 cups of coffee each. When Cole received notice that Clyde had legal representation and that the Veterans' Provision of the Homestead Act had been invoked, he made one more attempt, which was to offer a substantially higher sum, enough to set a man up comfortably somewhere else. Clyde refused again, this time in writing, and the refusal had a clean finality to it that apparently persuaded Cole the fight was not worth the investment, because he turned his attention to other properties in other counties and was not heard from again in Caldwell. Caldwell watched this outcome with various expressions. Garrett said Townsend was a fool to turn down that kind of money. Aldrich said it was a man's right to keep what he had built. Hargrove said nothing but smiled his quiet smile. August came with its relentless heat and its tremendous skies, and the wheat harvest began. And this was the first of the seasons where Elsie understood, with a visceral certainty that no amount of observation from a distance could have given her, what Clyde Townsend's daily life actually required. She came out to the farm on the Saturday of the first week of harvest because she had heard from Aldrich that Clyde had been planning to hire 2 men from town to help with the cutting, and that one of them had taken sick and the other had gotten a better offer from a larger spread to the north. She arrived at 7 in the morning in her work dress with her hair pinned back, and she told him she was there to help. He looked at her for a moment. "You've never worked a harvest?" "No," she said, "but I am not a delicate woman and I learn quickly and I can follow instructions. What do you need me to do?" He gave her a pitchfork and showed her how to manage the cut wheat behind the reaper, bundling it and stacking it in the way that would let it dry without mildew. She was not fast at first and her shoulders ached before the first hour was out, but she was steady and she did not complain and she improved hour by hour, the way she always improved at things methodically, through attention and repetition. They worked side by side through the long hot day, and at noon she made sandwiches from the food she had packed in a box on the wagon, and they sat in the shade of the wagon and ate without speaking much, both of them too tired for unnecessary words, and it was one of the most companionable silences she had ever sat in. His shoulder was against hers, and neither of them moved away. By the end of the day, when the light was going orange and the wheat was properly stacked and the horse was in the paddock with his water and his feed, Clyde sat on the steps of his porch and looked at his field and at the woman sitting beside him on those steps, and he said, in the voice of a man who had been working up to something for a long time, "I love you, Elsie Bancroft." She looked at him. His face was tanned and tired, and his hair was dusty, and his left sleeve was pinned back the way he wore it in the field, and he was looking at her with the kind of honesty that was almost uncomfortable in its directness, no softening of it, no performance. "I love you too," she said. "I have been in love with you since the morning you told me about the 3 versions of the plow brace." Something moved across his face, relief and joy together, both of them quiet. He lifted his right hand and touched her cheek, very gently, as if making certain she was real. "I am not an easy man," he said. "I am solitary in my habits and I don't always know how to ask for help, and the farm is always the first demand on my time." "I know all of that," she said. "I am not a soft woman. I am particular and opinionated, and I will not manage this land the way you do it just because you have always done it that way. I will want to discuss things." "I have noticed that about you," he said. "Is it a problem?" she asked. "It is the opposite of a problem," he said. He kissed her then, there on the porch steps in the August evening, and it was unhurried and certain, the way everything he did was, and the prairie went on around them in every direction, enormous and golden and indifferent to small human things, which made the smallness of the moment 2 people, a porch step, a kiss, somehow all the more precious. He asked her to marry him 3 weeks later. He did not make a production of it. He came to her house on a Sunday evening and sat across from her at the kitchen table where they had discussed Cole's legal challenge, and he said, "I want you to be my wife. I want to build what I am building with you. I know what I am asking you to give up, and I know that what I am offering in return is a hard life and a lot of weather and a man who doesn't always find words easily. But I will be faithful to you, and I will work beside you, and I will never be less than honest with you. That is the full accounting of it." Elsie looked at him for a long time, not because she was undecided. She was not, but because she wanted to give the question the gravity it deserved. "Yes," she said, "that is yes, Clyde." He exhaled slowly as if he had been holding his breath for longer than 3 weeks. "There is one thing," she said. "Say it." "The children I want to have with you, they will all go to school, and they will all learn to read, and I will not apologize to anyone for that." "They will," he said, "every one of them," and the way he said it made her understand that this was not a concession but a conviction. They were married in October of 1878 in the Methodist Church in Caldwell, with Aldrich giving Elsie away in the absence of her family. Her parents had been invited, but her father's health had not permitted the journey, and she had received a letter from her mother that was warm and approving. which was more than she had expected from a woman who had very much wanted her daughter to marry a man from a good Cincinnati family. Hargrove and his wife were there, and the school board, and a surprising number of Clyde's neighbors, men who worked the land around his, and who had quietly come to respect him over 4 years of watching him refuse to quit. Garrett and Pitts were not there, but that was not a loss that anyone mourned. The ceremony was simple and short, and afterward there was a supper at the church hall where Hargrove's wife and 2 other women had arranged more food than 50 people could reasonably eat, and there was a fiddle player and a squeezebox player who played until midnight, and Elsie danced with Aldrich and with Hargrove and with 3 of the neighboring farmers, and then, finally, with her husband, who it turned out could dance with a particular quiet grace that she had not expected, leading with his right hand at her waist and the whole of his attention on her, so that the missing arm was simply not a thing that existed in the space between them. "You can dance," she said, surprised. "My mother made all of us learn," he said. "She said a man who couldn't dance was a man who had given up on joy. She was a remarkable woman. She would have been very happy tonight," he said, and he pulled her a little closer, and the fiddle played, and the church hall was warm and full of lamplight, and outside the Kansas night was enormous and cold and full of stars. They drove home to his farm, their farm, that night under those stars, with the prairie dark and quiet around them, and they began the life they had been building toward since the morning of the fence and the plow. The first winter of their marriage was a hard one, which was entirely in keeping with what Kansas felt its obligations were to people who chose to live there. The cold came early and deep, and there was a stretch of 3 weeks in January where the temperature barely climbed above freezing even in the middle of the day. Clyde had prepared for this, as he prepared for most things, with a thoroughness that Elsie found she could rely on completely. The root cellar was full. The hay was in. The animals were bedded in the barn, with sufficient insulation. The house was small but well chinked, and the stove was good, and they spent those 3 cold weeks in an intimacy that had the quality of something old and essential, 2 people keeping each other warm against the world. She taught herself the farm. She asked questions constantly, and he answered them without impatience, having apparently made peace with the fact that she would not be directed but only informed, and that she would then do things in the way that made the best sense to her. Occasionally this was a different way than the way he had been doing them, and twice it was a better way, which he acknowledged without resentment, and both those times she admired him considerably for it. In February she learned that she was pregnant. She sat with this knowledge for 2 days before she told him, not because she was afraid of his response, but because she wanted to have her own relationship to the fact of it first, to understand what she felt before she watched his face and let his reaction become part of her experience of it. What she felt was a particular kind of joy, not giddy but deep, the way the roots of good wheat went into the earth. She told him on a Sunday morning while he was at the barn, standing in the barn doorway with the cold light coming in around her. He turned from what he was doing and looked at her. "We are going to have a baby," she said. He walked to her and held her face in his right hand and pressed his forehead to hers, and the warmth of him in the cold barn was everything. "When?" he said, close and quiet. "October, I think, perhaps September." "After the harvest," he said. "After the harvest," she agreed. He laughed, a real laugh, warm and unguarded, the laugh she had been slowly and carefully drawing out of him all through the autumn and winter, the laugh that belonged to the man he was when no one was watching. "Of course. You would time it perfectly. I am an educator," she said. "Timing is a professional skill." He kissed her, still laughing, and the horses shifted in their stalls, and the winter morning was cold and bright outside the barn, and it was an entirely good day. The spring of 1879 brought the legal resolution of Cole's challenge, which Caldwell had been working through the land office bureaucracy with patience and precision. The findings came back in Clyde's favor in March. The veteran's provision had been applied, the filing was confirmed as valid, and the quarter section was definitively his. Clyde read the letter twice, folded it carefully, and put it in the iron box where he kept the important papers, and then went back to work on the fence he had been mending before the mail came. Elsie watched this from the kitchen window and thought, "That is the most that man will ever celebrate anything, and I'm entirely all right with that." The wheat came up better than the previous year, which was a better year than the one before that. Clyde had been improving the soil through a rotation system that his reading, he read widely, and with a farmer's practical hunger for applicable knowledge, had suggested would improve the structure of the clay-heavy south field. The oats he had planted as part of the rotation came up dense and heavy, and he sold them at a price that allowed him to repair the barn roof and buy the additional breeding stock he had been wanting for 2 years. In the town, things had shifted. Not dramatically. Caldwell was not a town that did anything dramatically, but steadily. There were new families coming in on the railroad, which had extended its line through the previous year, and the population had grown enough that the school board was discussing building a second schoolroom and hiring an assistant teacher. Elsie threw herself into this campaign with the organized energy she brought to everything she believed in, and by early summer the board had agreed to the expansion, and she was interviewing candidates for the assistant position. The 2 men who had built their identities on dismissing Clyde, Garrett, and Pitts had both, in the way of men whose primary occupation is other people's failures, moved on to other subjects. Garrett had lost his own small spread through gambling debts and moved his family to Wichita, which no one in Caldwell felt strongly about either way. Pitts was still around, but quieter, and there was something in the way he watched Clyde from across the street now that Elsie read as a particular kind of accounting. A man doing the slow mathematics of where his contempt had gotten him versus where Clyde's stubbornness had gotten Clyde. On a hot afternoon in late July, Elsie was at the store when Pitts came in for tobacco, and he stood at the counter while she was finishing her own transaction, and he said, without quite meeting her eyes, "Here Townsend's new oat crop came in strong this year." "It did," Elsie said. Pitts turned his tobacco over in his hands. "He's a hard worker," he said, and it came out with the particular heaviness of a sentence that cost something. "He is," Elsie said, and left it at that, because she was not a woman who required men to grovel, only to arrive at honesty on their own and in their own time. Their son was born on the 2nd of September, 1879, when the harvest was in, and the first edge of autumn was coming into the air. He came into the world in the farmhouse bedroom, delivered by the doctor from Caldwell and attended by Hargrove's wife, who had become a genuine friend to Elsie over the previous year. It was a long and difficult labor, 14 hours, and by the end of it Elsie was exhausted in a way that went to the bone, but the child was healthy and loud and outraged in the way of new things that have not yet made their peace with the world. Clyde sat by her bed holding the boy, who was wrapped in a flannel blanket that Elsie's mother had sent from Cincinnati when she heard about the pregnancy. He held the child in the crook of his right arm, and his shortened left forearm rested against the blanket as well, cradling in its own fashion, and the whole arrangement was so perfectly natural that there was nothing to remark upon. "What shall we call him?" Clyde asked. His voice was different. Not broken but opened in the way that certain great events open things in people. Elsie looked at her husband and at her son and thought for a moment. "James," she said. "For your mother, I know she was called Jamesona, which I always thought was a name of considerable character, and if you have no objection, Clyde James Hargrove Townsend, because Hargrove has been kind to us from the very beginning." Clyde looked at her, and the expression on his face was the kind that she had learned to recognize as Clyde Townsend's equivalent of a man who was so moved he might otherwise need to step outside. "That is a very good name," he said. Hargrove, when he heard what the boy had been named, did not say much about it because he was apparently busy examining the floor very carefully for several minutes. But his wife cried openly and brought over 2 apple pies the following day, which seemed like a reasonable response. The years that followed, And they were good years, years that had difficulty in them because all years did, but whose weight was of the kind that built rather than broke, unfolded with the steady richness of a life genuinely lived. Clyde expanded the operation cautiously, and with the precision that characterized everything he did, adding acreage when the finances supported it and not before. By 1882, the farm was 300 acres, with a wheat and oat crop that was consistently among the best in Sumner County, and a herd of 28 cattle that were his particular pride. He had written 2 letters to agricultural journals, one on the soil rotation system that had transformed his south field, and one on the adapted equipment designs he had been developing since his first winter on the homestead, and both had been published. And he had received correspondence from 2 other one-armed veterans asking about the brace design, to which he responded in full and without any charge. Elsie ran the school, which by 1881 had 3 rooms and 2 assistant teachers, and she was in the process of lobbying the State Board of Education, through a series of letters that were models of reasoned, well-documented argument, for a curriculum standard that would require consistent mathematics and natural science education in frontier schools, where the tendency was to focus on reading and arithmetic at the expense of everything else. She had also begun, quietly and without publicizing it, an evening class for adults who had come west without sufficient education, men and women, both teaching reading and basic arithmetic 2 nights a week in the school building. James grew into a lively, intelligent boy who was considerably more sociable than his father and considerably more practical than his mother, which suggested that he was some kind of ideal synthesis of the 2. He had Clyde's steadiness and Elsie's curiosity, and he could ride a horse at 4 and read a full page of primer at 5. And by the time he was 7, he had developed the habit of asking his father the most precise and specific questions about the farm that Clyde would later describe, with a combination of exasperation and pride, as his best and most demanding critic. Their second child came in 1883, a daughter this time, born in May, whom they called Ruth after the biblical figure whose loyalty Elsie had always found more admirable than the stories about more dramatic women. Ruth had Elsie's coloring and Clyde's deliberate disposition, and she was from her first months a person of considerable dignity, which made her a natural ally to her father and a mild exasperation to her brother. Caldwell had grown into a prosperous town by the early 1880s, with the railroad bringing regular commerce and new families, and the particular energy of a place that was no longer just surviving, but beginning to build something with permanence in mind. The cattle trade ran through, bringing all the attendant spectacle and occasional disorder, but the town's permanent residents had established their own institutions with enough solidity that the trade didn't shake the foundations. There was a day in the summer of 1883 that Elsie would remember for the rest of her life, not because anything dramatic occurred, but because of the quality of the ordinary that filled it so completely. It was a Saturday morning in late August. The harvest was beginning. She had come out to the north field where Clyde was working with James, who at 4 years old was not so much helping as conducting a thorough inspection of everything his father did, with the same focused attention he brought to all investigations. Ruth was on a blanket in the shade of the wagon, sleeping with the contentment of a baby who had eaten well and found the world's temperature acceptable. Elsie stood at the edge of the field and watched her husband. He was using a newer version of the Reaper, one of the improved mechanical models that had become available, and he had modified the operator's position slightly to accommodate his control preference, in the way he modified all equipment, with a quiet practical intelligence that had no vanity in it. James was walking beside him asking him questions that Clyde was answering with the patient thoroughness he gave to all of James's questions, which was the same thoroughness he gave to everything. A man on horseback came along the road, a neighbor named Hollies from the spread to the north, a man who had come to respect Clyde over the years of adjacent farming and occasional fence line cooperation. Holly stopped and watched for a moment and then called out, "That the new Reaper from the catalog." "Modified," Clyde called back. "I'll show you what I changed when you have a moment." "I'd appreciate that," Holly said, and there was nothing in his voice but genuine interest. Elsie thought, this is it. This is the whole accounting. 4 years ago those men outside Hargrove's store called him half a man, and here is what half a man had built in 4 years. The farm and the fields and the animals and the letters in agricultural journals and the neighbor who wanted to learn his modification, and the boy walking beside him full of questions, and the baby sleeping in the shade and me standing here. This is the architecture. She walked out into the field to help, because the morning was beautiful and the wheat was heavy and the work was good. Clyde looked up when she reached him and held out the basket of food she had carried. He looked at her with the clear eyes that had never needed a great many words to say what they were saying. "You should be inside," he said. "You worked late last night on those board letters." "The letters will keep," she said. "Help me understand this new section of the Reaper. James has been explaining it to me, but I think there may be some gaps in his technical knowledge." "There are no gaps," James said, with the absolute conviction of a 4-year-old. Clyde smiled at her over the top of their son's hat, that rare, genuine smile that she had been collecting since the morning of the fence, each one a thing of value, and he showed her the mechanism, and she listened, and James corrected 2 things that were technically accurate but, he felt, insufficiently emphasized, and the morning went on in the way that good mornings went. The years continued to be good, and to be full of difficulty, and to be genuinely theirs. In 1885, a severe drought year that tested every farm in the county, Clyde's preparation and his soil management meant that they lost a portion of the wheat but not a catastrophic portion, and the cattle carried the season. 2 neighboring families who had not been so prepared needed help, and Clyde and Elsie gave it without ceremony: food from the root cellar, hay from the barn, a loan of equipment. This was simply what you did, and they did it. The school board, in a gesture that was not without its political dimensions, offered Elsie the position of district superintendent, which would have required her to relinquish direct teaching for an administrative role. She thought about it carefully for a week, walked the issue around from every direction, discussed it with Clyde at the kitchen table over several evenings, and then declined, writing the board a letter explaining that she believed her value was in the classroom with the children, and that the administrative work, while important, was better done by someone whose strength was in that particular direction rather than in hers. Clyde read the letter after she had sent it and said, "That was the right decision." "You think so?" She was always interested in his thinking, especially when she had already decided. "You are a teacher," he said. "The way I am a farmer. The administrative work would have kept you from the thing you are actually best at. Most people would say the superintendency was the better position. Most people mistake authority for purpose," he said. She looked at him across the table and felt again what she always felt in these moments: the specific satisfaction of being known and understood by the person who mattered most, the sense of being truly seen. "I married the right man," she said. "I have been aware of that from my side for some time," he said dryly, and she threw a dish towel at him, which he caught. James Townsend, at age 7, announced to his father on a summer morning in 1886 that he intended to study engineering when he was grown, because he wanted to design better farm equipment for people who needed it. He said this with the certainty of a person who had given the matter serious thought and arrived at a conclusion. Clyde was quiet for a moment and then said, "There is a good engineering program at the State Agricultural College in Manhattan." "I know," James said. "I read the catalog." "When did you read the catalog?" "Mama got it for me," James said. Clyde looked at Elsie over their son's head, and there was a particular light in his eyes, something that was pride and amusement and gratitude and love all together. The particular compound emotion that their life had taught him was available, that he had not always known was possible. "All right," he said to James. "Then we have some time to prepare for that." Ruth, meanwhile, had developed a pronounced interest in horses that went considerably beyond riding them for transportation. She wanted to understand them, their communication, their training, the relationship between a horse and a person who worked with rather than against the animal's nature. She had been watching how Clyde worked with horses since she was old enough to stand at a fence rail and take notes in the small notebook she had started keeping at age 5, and she had a natural intuition for it that Clyde recognized and quietly encouraged. By the time she was 4, she could walk into a paddock with a young horse and move around it with the kind of instinctive regard for the animal's point of view that most horsemen spent years developing. Clyde watched this and said very little about it directly, but he took her with him to the horse sales in Wichita and let her watch the evaluations, and he answered all her questions with the same thoroughness he gave James's questions, and he adjusted her technique when it needed adjusting in the matter-of-fact way he adjusted everything that wasn't working at its best. In the autumn of 1887, when James was 8 and Ruth was 4, Elsie's mother finally made the journey from Cincinnati that her father's poor health had prevented for years. He had died in 1885. Elsie had received the telegram with the mix of grief and complicated love that was the honest response to the death of a man you had loved and also quietly outgrown, and her mother, a small, determined woman named Harriet who had finally, in widowhood, found herself with the freedom to act on her own desires, came west on the train to see her daughter's life. Harriet Bancroft arrived at the Caldwell station on a Tuesday morning with a trunk, a hat box, and the expression of a woman who had prepared herself to be politely approving of circumstances she expected to find difficult. She was 62 years old and had spent 40 years managing the idea that a woman's life was the frame around a man's, and she had accepted this without complaint because she was not a woman who knew how to change the frame, only work within it. She stayed for 3 weeks, and somewhere in the middle of the second week something shifted in her. She had watched Clyde work. She had sat in Elsie's school and watched her daughter teach 30 children with the kind of authority that had nothing in it of authority by position and everything of authority by genuine knowledge and care. She had eaten at their table and listened to the conversations, the real conversations, the ones about soil rotation and curriculum standards, and what James had decided about the engineering program, and what Ruth had observed about the young mare's behavior in the paddock. And she had watched the way Clyde looked at Elsie across the table, that look that contained everything he was too private to say in company but said anyway clearly, to anyone paying attention. On the last evening of her visit, Harriet sat with Elsie on the porch in the late autumn dark, and after a long quiet she said, "I thought you had made a reckless choice coming out here." "I know," Elsie said. "I understand now that I had no idea what recklessness was," Harriet said. "This life you have built, this is not recklessness. This is everything I would have wanted for you if I had known how to want it." Elsie took her mother's hand. "It is a good life, Mama." "It is a very good life," Harriet said. "That man of yours, he is not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Harriet was quiet for a moment. "I expected someone who needed managing. I think I expected a kind of sadness in him. And instead I see a man who knows exactly who he is," Harriet said, "which is considerably rarer than any amount of two-handedness." Elsie smiled at the darkness. "I told Mabel Sutton something like that years ago. She thought I was being foolish." "Mabel Sutton thinks a great deal of things that aren't true," Harriet said, and Elsie laughed, and Harriet laughed too, the kind of laugh between two women who understand each other across all the years of not quite understanding. Clyde drove Harriet to the station the following morning, and the old woman stood on the platform and took his right hand in both of hers and said, "You take care of my daughter." "She takes equally good care of herself," Clyde said, which was exactly the right thing to say, and Harriet knew it, and her eyes went bright. "Yes," she said, "I see that." She went back to Cincinnati on the train, and she wrote every month for the rest of her life, and her letters were full of questions about the farm and the school and the children that were specific and engaged. The questions of someone who had revised her understanding of the world and found the revision agreeable. The spring of 1888 brought new life in the form of a second daughter. They named her Clara, after no one in particular, and in the interest of giving the child a name that was entirely her own. Clara proved from her first weeks to be a person of considerable temperament, loud and determined, and given to very clear expressions of preference, which Clyde looked at with the expression of a man who was outnumbered by the universe but not displeased about it. "She is very much herself," Elsie observed, holding Clara on a March morning while snow came down outside the window. "She is very much you," Clyde said. "Is that a complaint?" "It is the highest possible compliment," he said, and kissed the top of her head. James, at age 9, had taken on a small section of the farm's mechanical maintenance as his official domain, not as a game but as a genuine contribution, his father having recognized that the boy had the instinct for it and the right temperament of patient, systematic investigation. He spent Saturday mornings going over the equipment, the way a good mechanic went over a machine looking for what was wearing, what was misaligned, what needed attention before it became a problem. Clyde reviewed his findings at the end of each morning with the same seriousness he would have given a grown hand, and twice James had identified things that would have become genuine problems if they had gone to the field. Ruth, at 5, had begun to ride, and rode with the natural ease of someone who had been thinking about it for years before she was big enough to do it. The farm was real and living and particular, and it was theirs. In the summer of 1889, Kansas was discussing statehood developments and constitutional changes, and there was a stir in Caldwell because the new Kansas Constitution was being debated, and there was a provision on the table regarding women's suffrage in school board elections, which had already been granted in some Kansas counties. Elsie threw herself into this discussion with everything she had, writing letters, attending meetings, organizing the women who shared her views, and making the case in the patient, relentless, documented way she made all her cases. Clyde sat through the first meeting she organized in the church hall, the only man in the room, and afterward she asked him if he had been uncomfortable. "No," he said. "Why would I be? Because you were the only man there. I imagine you have been the only woman in rooms full of men making decisions about your school and your curriculum and your pay for 10 years, he said. "I think I can manage one meeting." She looked at him with the full weight of how much she loved him. "You are a remarkable man, Clyde Townsend. I am a man who knows what sense looks like," he said. "It doesn't seem to me that complicated." The suffrage provision passed in Caldwell's county, and Elsie voted in the school board election that fall. She had written to her mother about it, and Harriet's response came back with a particular trembling quality in the penmanship that suggested she had cried while writing it. In 1890, the year that the frontier was being officially declared closed by Eastern newspapers and politicians who had decided that the land had been sufficiently tamed, though the land, Elsie had always felt, was not something that was ever tamed, only something you came to terms with. Clyde turned 40 years old and Elsie turned 37, and their farm was 340 acres, and their children were 11 and 7 and 2. And their life was the kind of life that needed no augmentation or explanation. On the evening of his birthday, she sat with him on the porch where she had heard him say "I love you" for the first time in the August dark of 1878, and the same prairie went on around them as it always had, as it always would. "What are you thinking about?" she asked him. He was quiet for a moment. The evening was warm and there were fireflies in the grass, which James had been trying to catch from the yard with his sister Ruth before their mother had sent them to bed. And Clara was asleep inside with the deep abandon of a toddler who had worn out every possible energy. "I am thinking about the south field," he said, and she started to laugh, and then he said, "And I am thinking that I have a better life than I had any right to expect and that I know it." "We built it," she said. "We did," he said. "Together." He reached for her hand in the dark, and she gave it to him, and the fireflies moved in the grass, and the prairie was enormous and indifferent and beautiful, and the two of them were small and entirely present within it, alive in the particular way that people are alive when they are exactly where they are supposed to be. Time moved forward as it does, inexorably and full of texture. James Townsend, at age 16, left for the State Agricultural College in Manhattan, Kansas, in 1895, with a trunk and a collection of his father's equipment drawings, and a letter of reference from his mother that was 3 pages long, and which the department head later told a colleague was the most persuasive letter he had ever received on behalf of an entering student. Clyde drove him to the Caldwell station on a September morning, and when they said goodbye on the platform, the two of them stood looking at each other with the particular difficulty of men who love each other deeply and have no social practice for expressing it. "Work harder than everyone else," Clyde said. "I know," James said. "Ask questions until you understand, not just until it seems like you should stop asking. I know. Write your mother every week." "I know, Papa." Clyde put his right hand on his son's shoulder and held it there for a moment. "I am very proud of you," he said, and the directness of it Clyde had always been, where it mattered, entirely direct, made James's eyes go bright. "I know that too," James said. "I've always known that." Ruth, at 13, had taken over the horse management of the farm in a way that had gradually and naturally progressed from interest to contribution to essential competency. She was doing work with the horses that Clyde recognized was beyond his own skill, a deeper intuition for the animal's inner experience, a patience that was entirely her own, and he had told her so, which was one of the most important things he had ever said to her. Clara, at 7, had inherited what appeared to be the best of both her parents and perhaps more than either of them. Her mother's organizational intelligence and her father's deep quiet, with an additional quality that seemed entirely her own, which was a generosity of spirit that made every person in her presence feel more comfortable than they had been. In 1896, Elsie received a letter from the State Board of Education offering her the position of county superintendent for the second time, and this time she accepted it, because the conditions had changed. Her assistant teachers at the school were excellent and could carry the classroom work, and there were 6 schools in the county now whose teachers needed the kind of support and curriculum guidance she was uniquely positioned to provide. She discussed it with Clyde, and he listened carefully and asked his questions and said, "If that is where the work needs you now, then that is where you should be." She took the position and spent the next decade doing for the county's schools what she had done for Caldwell's single room, building them, improving them, fighting for the resources they needed with the patient, documented, relentless approach that she had perfected over 20 years of dealing with school boards. James came home from the college in 1898 with a degree in mechanical engineering, a new wife named Alice who was from Topeka and who had the quality of steadiness that seemed to run in the women James chose to spend time with, and 2 concrete ideas for equipment modifications that he had been developing with one of his professors, specifically adapted for farmers with partial or full hand or arm limitations. He and Clyde spent an entire week in the barn, going over the designs. Elsie brought them meals and listened to the conversation and felt, with a completeness that was almost overwhelming, the rightness of the circle that had been drawn from a morning at a fence watching a man with a leather brace and a plow, to a grown son at a workbench building the next version of that brace, better and more general, for all the men who needed it. "You should apply for patents," Elsie told James over supper. "That is what Alice said," James said. "Alice is very sensible," Elsie said. "You did well." "I know," James said, with the contentment of a man who was entirely clear on the good fortune of his situation. The patents were applied for and received the following year, and the designs were manufactured by a farm equipment company in Topeka that had the good sense to recognize what they had. And within 3 years, The modified equipment was being sold across 5 states, and James and Alice had settled in Topeka to be near the manufacturer and the patent office, though they came home to the farm for every harvest and for the holidays. Ruth, at 17, married a young man from Wichita named Thomas Hollies, the son of their neighbor, now grown into a quiet, thoughtful person who had grown up watching Clyde Townsend's operation with the respect of someone who understood farming. And together they began a horse operation that was, within 5 years, one of the better breeding programs in Kansas, drawing specifically on Ruth's particular gift for understanding horses and Thomas's solid business sense. Clara, at 12, was already the most accomplished student in the Caldwell school's history according to her teachers, who were not the kind of people to make such statements lightly. The farm was in full, mature operation, its reputation established across the county as a model of what patient, intelligent management could build over 20 years. Men came to talk to Clyde about soil rotation and equipment design with the respect due an expert, and he met them the way he had always met people, directly, without performance, with the actual useful knowledge given freely. Mabel Sutton had moved away in 1891, her husband having taken a position in Dodge City, and Caldwell's gossip had reorganized itself around other subjects without particular difficulty. Hargrove had died in 1893, which had been a grief in the town and a genuine one in the Townsend household. They had named their son partly for him, and he had been the first person in Caldwell to extend Elsie Bancroft the small courtesy of treating her intelligence as ordinary, which it was, in the best sense of ordinary, as common, unremarkable, simply what was expected. His wife still lived in Caldwell, and she and Elsie had lunch together every Tuesday, and she had become the children's honorary grandmother in the way that certain people become family through the simple, sustained act of loving well. On a September morning in 1900, a new century, which the newspapers were making a great deal of and which felt, in Caldwell, much like September had always felt, with the particular quality of light and the smell of the turned earth and the harvest coming in. Elsie and Clyde walked the farm together in the early morning, the way they had taken to doing on the mornings that the work allowed it. They walked the fence lines and the field boundaries, and the farm was evident around them in its full accumulated character. 22 years of decisions and adjustments and harvests and winters and setbacks and solutions, all of it visible in the soil quality and the fence posts and the animal pens and the barn roof that James had helped replace in 1896 and the new equipment shed that Clyde had built the previous winter. Elsie walked with her hand in the crook of his right arm, which was where it had lived on their walks for 22 years, and he walked with the particular ease of a man entirely at home in his place. "What are you thinking about?" he asked her. He always asked first now. He had learned over 20 years that she thought in ways that were worth knowing. "I am thinking about that morning in April of '78, she said, "when I stood at this fence line and watched you work. I remember it," he said. "I thought, there is a man who has solved a hard problem with patience and intelligence, and I want to know how he thinks." "And now you know," he said. "Now I know," she said. "It is everything I thought it would be and considerably more." He stopped walking and turned to look at her, and she looked back, and the morning was around them in its September light, and the farm was around them in its September purpose. And he was 51 and she was 47, and they had been married for 22 years. And the look that passed between them was the same look it had always been, clear and steady and certain. The look of two people who had looked at each other honestly for a very long time and found, each time, that what was there was enough. More than enough was in fact the whole of what mattered. "I love you," he said, which he said every day and meant every time. "I love you," she said, which was true with the full and particular truth of a thing that had been tested thoroughly, and had not broken but had only grown stronger in the testing. He pulled her close, there in the morning field, and she rested against him, and the farm went on around them, and the new century was beginning, and their children were grown and living and building their own things in the world, and their grandchildren would come, as James and Alice were already expecting their first another boy, which James had written about with a joy that Elsie recognized as a specific echo of Clyde's own joy on a September morning 21 years before. There would be more seasons and more harvests and more difficulties and more evenings on the porch with the fireflies in the grass. There would be James's son, born in November of that year, whom they named Elliot Clyde Townsend, and who from his first year had his grandfather's hands and his grandmother's eyes and some entirely new quality that was entirely his own. There would be Ruth and Thomas bringing their first daughter to the farm for Christmas, a small fierce creature named Me who had Ruth's intuition and Thomas's practicality in equal measure. There would be Clara, at 14, writing a school essay on the importance of education on the frontier that her teacher submitted to the Kansas City paper, where it was published and discussed, the first of many things Clara Townsend would publish in her life. There would be more long mornings in the field and more evenings at the kitchen table, and more of the 1,000 ordinary particular things that made up a life genuinely lived together. But right now, on this September morning at the start of a new century, it was Elsie and Clyde standing in their field, and it was enough. It was everything. She had said it once to Mabel Sutton, years ago, and it had only become more true with every year that had confirmed it. She had never in her life seen a whole man accomplish half of what Clyde Townsend did every single day. Not the farming alone, or the equipment, or the land management, or the patience with the horses, though all of those things were true and remarkable. But the whole of it, the way he had looked at his life after the injury and decided, without drama or self-pity, simply to find the better version. The way he had built everything they had from an empty quarter section, and a will that did not know how to be smaller than the work required. The way he had loved her fully, steadily, honestly, without reserve, and let himself be loved back with equal fullness. The way he had fathered their children with the same quiet, powerful attention he gave the land, and watched them grow into people who were better than either of their parents, which was what parents were supposed to want. That was a whole man. That was the whole of a man. The people who had called him half years ago had not been measuring in the right direction. They had been measuring what was missing, and the measuring of absence was the smallest way to understand anything. Elsie had always measured what was there. What was there in Clyde Townsend was everything. The morning continued. The farm continued. The century, young and new, continued to become itself in the great rolling way of all centuries, indifferent to the smallness of individual lives and entirely composed of them. Elsie Townsend, who had once been Elsie Bancroft, who had come west on the train with a trunk and a letter and a refusal to build small, stood in the field of her life and found it very large indeed. And beside her was the man who had built it with her, whose arm was around her shoulders in the morning light, whose face, when she looked up at it, was peaceful and present in hers, as it had been for 22 years, as it would be for all the years that the generous earth still had to offer them. It was a good life. It was the right life. It was, completely and without remainder, theirs.